A Jerusalem Perspective production.
Love That Costs, Jesus, the Good Samaritan, and the Enemy Next Door, by Katya Motseva, read by the author.
Most people think of the parable of the Good Samaritan as a story about the kind man who helped a stranger in need, like someone paying your grocery bill at the store, stopping to help you change a flat tire, or offering a hand when you're struggling to carry a heavy load. Yet the parable is far more than a heartwarming moral tale. It is a story about rival enemies, bound by a shared past, marked by betrayal, mistrust, and resentment, whose encounter becomes a radical call to action, to act with compassion and self-giving love, even when it comes at great personal cost. The parable appears in only one of the four Gospels, the Gospel of Luke. It begins with an expert in the law approaching Jesus with a question.
And look, an expert of the law stood up in order to test him, saying, "Teacher, by doing what will I inherit eternal life?" Luke 10:25.
Some translations refer to the man as a lawyer, but this can be misleading for modern readers, as it commonly suggests someone working within a criminal justice system. The Greek term translated as lawyer refers instead to an expert in the law, and in a Jewish context, the law means the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the books of Moses. Thus, it was a Torah scholar, a respected expert in the Jewish law, who questioned Jesus. His inquiry, "By doing what will I inherit eternal life?" should have been straightforward for someone well-versed in the Torah. Therefore, it seems unlikely that he asked merely to acquire knowledge. More likely, he sought to discover Jesus' own position on the matter. Jesus responded by turning the question back to him.
And he, that is Jesus, said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" Luke 10:26.
In Judaism, learning has long involved asking questions and responding to them with further questions. This method serves both to assess a disciple's or another teacher's knowledge and to encourage further reflection and discussion. As a Jewish teacher operating within this framework, Jesus redirected the question asking, "What does the Torah say?" Or, "How do you interpret the Torah?" For Jesus, as for other Jews of his time, the Torah was the definitive and authoritative standard for faith in practice. The Torah scholar then answered his own question.
And answering he said, "You shall love the Lord your God out of your whole heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Luke 10:27.
The command to love God with all one's heart comes from the Torah, and is part of what may be called Judaism's central confession, the Shema. It begins with the words, "Shema Israel," meaning, "Hear, O Israel," and continues, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength." Deuteronomy 6:4 and 5. The Shema was, and remains, foundational to Jewish life and practice. Many Jewish martyrs are said to have died with its words on their lips. The command to love one's neighbor comes from the book of Leviticus. "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Leviticus 19:18. By the time of Jesus, this verse was already linked with Deuteronomy 6:5 through established Jewish methods of interpretation. Jesus, in agreement with other Jewish sages of his time, affirmed that these two commands, loving God and loving one's neighbor, together constitute the greatest commandment. All the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, what Christians commonly called the Old Testament, are to be understood and interpreted in their light. Jesus accepted the Torah scholar's answer, but he pressed the point further.
And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." Luke 10:28.
Knowing the correct answer, Jesus implied was not sufficient. The Torah scholar was called to put this knowledge into practice. The scholar, however, was still not satisfied.
But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Luke 10:29.
Whether this question was intended as another test, or asked in genuine earnestness, is less important than the question itself. Who exactly qualified as a neighbor? This issue was actively debated in Jesus' time. The Hebrew word, translated neighbor, rea, had a wide range of meanings beyond neighbor, including friend, lover, and comrade companion. In legal, prophetic, and wisdom texts, however, rea typically referred to someone with whom an Israelite had a covenantal or legal relationship. As a result, the command to love one's neighbor was generally interpreted restrictively, and usually applied only to members of the covenant community. The Torah scholar, therefore, sought to determine Jesus' opinion on the precise boundaries of this obligation. Some Jewish groups, such as the Qumran sectarians who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, expressed hatred toward all outsiders, labeling themselves the sons of light, and everyone else the sons of darkness. This suggests that anyone outside their community, including fellow Jews, would not have been regarded as neighbor. On the other hand, early rabbinic sources indicate that the Pharisees, or at least some of their descendants, understood neighbor to exclude Samaritans, Gentiles, and resident aliens. The Torah scholar, in essence, was asking, how far does the responsibility to love one's neighbor extend? Where did Jesus draw the boundary line? Perhaps other groups, such as the Sadducees, Herodians, Zealots, apostates, and heretics, were also meant to be excluded. Rather than entering into a legal debate, Jesus chose a different approach. He responded with a parable.
Replying, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who, after stripping him and beating him, departed, leaving him half dead." Luke 10:30.
The road from Jerusalem to Jericho is approximately 17 miles long, a day's journey on foot being between 17 and 23 miles, and it can still be seen today. The route is characterized by steep cliffs, sudden drops, and long stretches of barren rocky terrain. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish priest, political leader, and historian, describes it as follows.
The distance from Jerusalem to Jericho is 150 furlongs, and from the Jordan, 60. The country from Jericho to Jerusalem is desert and rocky. To the Jordan and the lake Asphaltitis, the Dead Sea, the ground is lower, though equally wild and barren.
Because the road connected Jerusalem with the mineral wealth of the Dead Sea and the spice route beyond, it was frequented by travelers with valuable cargo. This route, already dangerous because of the terrain and lack of fresh water, was doubly so because of the threat of robbers. The Greek geographer and historian Strabo records that the Roman general Pompey took measures to secure the area, destroying brigand forts near Jericho in the 1st century BCE.
Pompey, so far as he could, destroyed the haunts of robbers and the treasure holds of the tyrants. 2 of these were situated on the passes leading to Hyricus, Jericho. I mean Threx and Taurus.
Similarly, Jerome, the 4th century Latin priest, historian, and theologian, attests to the continued presence of Arab robbers who lay in wait along the road in his own day.
Arabs make incursions into the borders of Palestine and lie in wait on the roads for those going down from Jerusalem to Jericho.
Approximately 12 to 13 miles from Jerusalem and 5 miles from Jericho lies a narrow pass. The ancient Roman road likely ran through it, as does the modern highway, since it is the shortest route between the two cities. Today, the pass is called Talat ad-Dam in Arabic, meaning ascent of blood. In the Hebrew scriptures, it is referred to as Ma'ale Adumim, or ascent of red objects, probably in reference to its reddish soil. Jerome, on the other hand, calls it the ascent of the red, attributing the name to the blood shed in countless murders and robberies along the route. Both Jerome and the Crusaders believed this was the location for the Good Samaritan parable. The robbers in the parable stripped the traveler and stole his clothes, a valuable commodity at the time, removing any visible markers of his status and identity. Given the location of the attack and the context of Jesus' dialogue with the Torah scholar regarding the definition of neighbor, however, it is reasonable to assume that the injured man was understood to be Jewish.
Now by chance a priest was going down on that road, and when he saw him he passed by on the other side. Luke 10:31.
Who were the priests? They were members of the tribe of Levi and descendants of Aaron, the first high priest and the brother of Moses. Priests served in the Jerusalem temple, offering sacrifices and overseeing all temple services and practices. They constituted the religious elite of Jewish society and enjoyed public prestige, recognition, and honor, even though many lived in modest or economically precarious circumstances. Why did the priest fail to help the injured man? One common explanation, often offered in his defense, is that he may have been on his way to serve in the temple. A significant number of priests resided in Jericho. The Babylonian Talmud even claims that at one point, half of the priests in the country lived there. It is even possible that the injured man on the road was a priest himself. If the priest was headed for the temple, he might have been concerned about ritual impurity. Jews in a state of ritual impurity could not enter the temple, and contact with a dead body caused the greatest degree of impurity. According to the Torah, whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be impure 7 days, and whoever in the open field touches someone who was killed with a sword or who died naturally, or touches a human bone or a grave, shall be impure 7 days. Entering the temple in a state of corpse impurity would have desecrated the sanctuary, a capital offense punishable by death. To restore ritual purity, the corpse-contaminated person was sprinkled with water containing the ashes of a burnt red heifer, and then washed their clothes and bathed. Priests, however, were held to an even higher standard. They were not permitted to contract corpse impurity except for immediate family members, and the high priest could not even do so for his parents. Fear of ritual impurity may thus help explain why the priest crossed to the other side. Ritual concerns went beyond direct contact with the corpse. Early rabbinic sources indicate that many Pharisees, as well as a large number of Jews in general, believed that anyone or anything that overshadowed or was overshadowed by a dead body became unclean. In other words, even if the shadow of a corpse falling on a person, or vice versa, rendered them ritually impure. Walking over a grave was likewise considered contaminating. One important detail in the parable, however, makes it improbable that the priest was on his way to serve in the temple. The text says he was going down. The road to Jericho descends roughly 3,300 feet from Jerusalem. If the priest had been headed to the temple, he would have been traveling up, not down. Moreover, when a division of priests, Levites, and laymen went to serve, they gathered and traveled together in groups to and likely from Jerusalem. Therefore, it is unlikely that a priest traveling alone on this road was on his way to temple duty. Some might argue that the priests were prohibited from touching dead bodies in any case, Yet, the parable does not indicate that the man was dead, and the priest was not even willing to check. He simply crossed over to the other side. In the end, whether motivated by heartlessness or misguided religious piety, the fact remains. The priest chose to pass by and ignored the man in need.
Also, likewise, a Levite, when he came upon the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Luke 10:32.
What justification might the Levite have claimed? Levites were descendants of Levi who did not belong to the Aaronic priestly line. In the 1st century, they served in the Jerusalem temple as singers and musicians in the Levitical choir, and also functioned as gatekeepers and temple guards. Unlike priests, the Torah does not forbid Levites from contracting corpse impurity. Nevertheless, they were required to maintain ritual purity while engaged in temple service. As already noted, however, such a concern seems unlikely in this scenario, since both the priest and the Levite were traveling alone. Yet in the parable, the Levite behaves no differently from the priest. One might argue that the Levite actually came closer to the injured man than the priest did. The text says that he came upon the place and saw him, which may suggest that he assessed the situation more carefully, considered that the man was near death, and then chose to pass by on the other side. His action, despite having fewer explicit purity restrictions than the priest, exposes a broader issue: the differing ways in which Jewish groups in the 1st century interpreted the Torah. Whereas the Sadducees were closely associated with the Jerusalem priestly leadership and tended to follow the law in a more literal manner, the Pharisees, who were generally not priests, emphasized the interpretation and application of the Torah in light of contemporary circumstances. These differing approaches created tension between priestly concerns for ritual purity and Pharisaic interpretations that stressed ethical and moral responsibility. According to the Pharisaic oral law, as preserved in the later codification of the Mishnah, although the Torah forbids the high priest from defiling himself with a dead body, even for his parents, he was nevertheless obligated to do so in the case of a person who had no one to bury him. In the parable, however, the injured man was not even dead, but described as half-dead, placing him under another Pharisaic principle. Rabbinic literature refers to such a person whose condition is expected to result in imminent death as a gosses. Despite his dire prospects, rabbinic law regarded such a person as being fully alive in every respect. This meant that the injured man fell under another overriding Pharisaic principle: the obligation to preserve human life, which takes precedence over almost all other commandments. Therefore, even if the priest and the Levite could justify their behavior in their own eyes, their inaction would have been judged harshly by the Pharisees and the common people, among whom Pharisaic teaching was widely respected. Even if the man had been dead, they should have stopped to bury him. Since he was still alive, they should have done everything in their power to save his life, an obligation that applied equally to priests and Levites alike.
But a Samaritan, while traveling, came upon him, and when he saw him, he had compassion. Luke 10:33.
The person who appeared on the scene next was not who the listeners would have expected. They might have anticipated that an ordinary Israelite, or perhaps even a Pharisee, would come along and do the right thing. But, as he often did, Jesus chose to make his point by unsettling and surprising his audience. So instead, a Samaritan came upon the injured man and stopped to offer him help. Why would it have been such a shock that the man was a Samaritan? And who exactly were the Samaritans? When the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital, Samaria, were destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE, a large portion of the Israelite population was deported to other regions of the empire, while foreign peoples were settled in their place. These foreigners intermarried with the remaining local population and, at least initially, practiced a syncretistic form of religion, combining pagan worship with devotion to the God of Israel. almost 2 centuries later, after the return from the Babylonian exile in 539 BCE, the Judahites, now known as Judeans or Jews, began rebuilding the Jerusalem temple, which had been destroyed nearly 50 years earlier, in 586 BCE, by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. The Samaritans offered to assist in the reconstruction, but their help was rejected by the Jews, the reason given being their mixed ancestry. In response, they opposed the rebuilding of Jerusalem and harassed the Jewish population. Eventually, they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim near Shechem, which Josephus places during the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. The Samaritans argued that Gerizim, not Jerusalem, was the proper place for worship. Tensions between Jews and Samaritans continued to escalate. Josephus records that during the time when Antiochus III the Great made a peace treaty with Ptolemy V Epiphanes at the end of the 5th Syrian War, the Samaritans were enjoying a period of prosperity and were harassing the Jews by appropriating parts of their land and taking slaves, events that occurred during the high priesthood of Onias. During the persecutions under Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century BCE, the Samaritans refused to side with the Jews. According to Josephus, the Samaritans appealed to Antiochus IV, claiming they were not Jews and requesting not to be punished as such, even agreeing to adopt Greek religious practices. In 128 BCE, the Hasmonean ruler John Hyrcanus conquered the province of Samaria and destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, an act that had serious and long-lasting consequences. During the reign of Herod the Great, in the 1st century BCE, one of whose wives was a Samaritan, relations temporarily improved, as evidenced by the fact that Samaritans were permitted access to the inner courts of the Jerusalem temple. This period of relative peace ended, however, when, as Josephus recounts, during a Passover festival between 6 and 9 CE, a group of Samaritans entered the temple at night and scattered human bones under the porches and throughout the sanctuary. Whether intended as retaliation or not, the defilement undoubtedly caused a great disturbance during the feast, and the Samaritans were subsequently barred from re-entering the temple. The Mishnah preserves another episode of tension between the two groups. The Jews had devised a system for signaling the Babylonian diaspora about the start of a new month by lighting torches on mountaintops. The Samaritans, however, corrupted the system by lighting the torches at incorrect times to create confusion, forcing the Jewish sages to begin sending messengers instead. By the time of Jesus, hostility between Jews and Samaritans was firmly entrenched. When 1st century Galilean Jews traveled through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem, especially for the pilgrimage festivals, they were often harassed, and at times there was even bloodshed. Josephus recounts an incident in 52 CE, in which Galilean pilgrims were killed by Samaritans on their journey to Jerusalem. In retaliation, Jewish rebels killed a number of Samaritan men, women, and children, and then plundered and burned down their villages. The Roman procurator intervened, capturing the attackers, many of whom were executed. Second Temple Jewish sources frequently reflect an attitude of antagonism toward the Samaritans. Jews often pejoratively refer to them as Kuthians, referring to their descent from Median and Persian colonists. Josephus explains that while the Greeks referred to these people as Samaritai, in Hebrew they were called Kuthaioi, attesting to how widely this derogatory term was used among Jews. It is almost the exclusive term used for the Samaritans in rabbinic literature. Josephus also describes the Samaritans as apostates of the Jewish nation. Other Jewish sources treat them with contempt, calling them fools, questioning their ritual purity, and associating them with idolatry. Even Jesus referred to the Samaritans as foreigners. Even though the Samaritans accepted the Torah, and as far as we can tell, observed its commandments devoutly, their status in Jewish eyes remained ambiguous at best, only marginally above that of Gentile idolaters. Early Tannaitic sources debated whether Samaritans should be treated as Israelites or as Gentiles, while later Amoraic sources more decisively classified them as Gentiles. The minor tractate Kutim, likely of Palestinian origin and composed in the late Tannaitic or early Amoraic period, 3rd to 4th century CE, similarly forbids intermarriage and conditions full acceptance within the Jewish community on renouncing Mount Gerizim and affirming belief in the resurrection of the dead. This ambiguous status, neither fully Gentile nor fully Jewish, is likewise reflected in the New Testament. Returning to the parable, we can now appreciate the effect Jesus' words would have had on his audience. The moment a Samaritan entered the story, tension would have risen sharply among his Jewish listeners, who would not have expected anything good to come from such a figure. Yet, to their astonishment, it was this outsider, long despised and regarded as an enemy, who was moved with compassion and acted as a true neighbor to the wounded man.
And when he approached, he bandaged his wounds, pouring on olive oil and wine, and putting him on his own animal, he brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Luke 10:34.
Since Samaritans also observed the Torah, the Samaritan would not have been indifferent to the issue, or at least the inconvenience of ritual impurity, had the man lying on the road been dead. Yet unlike the priest and the Levite, who had in effect decided that the injured man was someone else's responsibility, he was moved by the stranger's suffering and chose to come to his aid, even though the man was half dead. In doing so, he exposed himself to considerable risk. The robbers might still have been nearby and attacked the Samaritan while he was helping the injured man. Or another passerby might have seen the Samaritan with the wounded traveler and accused him of assaulting a man who was likely Jewish, a charge that, as we have seen, could have carried serious consequences. Despite these dangers, the Samaritan drew near and tended to the stranger. He used olive oil and wine to treat the wounds and soothe his pain. Then he placed the injured man on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and continued to care for him there. The Samaritan's actions echo an earlier episode, recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 28. After the northern kingdom of Israel defeated the southern kingdom of Judah in battle, the northern Israelites, ancestors of the Samaritans, who had long been regarded by the Judahites as traitors for revolting and establishing a separate kingdom, and as idolaters for rejecting Jerusalem as the central place of worship while incorporating pagan practices into their religion, took a number of Judahite men captive. The prophet Oded rebuked them for doing so, and under the influence of several of their leaders, they released the captives. Those who were naked were clothed, sandals were provided, and the Judahites were given food, drink, and oil to anoint their skin. Those unable to walk were placed on donkeys, and all were brought back to Jericho, while the Israelites returned to their capital, Samaria. The parallels between the two stories are striking, and would not have been lost on Jesus' audience. Was he reminding his listeners of their own history and calling them to let go of their long-held hostility?
And on the next day, taking out 2 denarii, he gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and whatever you might spend further, I will repay you when I return." Luke 10:35.
The Samaritan paid the innkeeper 2 denarii to care for the injured man. Given that the cost of a day's board was approximately 1/12 of a denarius, and that 1 denarius represented a full day's wage, this generous sum would have provided the wounded man with several days of care. By also promising to repay any additional expenses upon his return, the Samaritan ensured that the man would receive continued treatment for as long as necessary. Finally, After concluding the parable, Jesus asked the Torah scholar,
"Which of these does it seem to you has been neighborly to the one who fell among the robbers?" And he, that is, the Torah expert, said, "The one who showed him compassion." And Jesus said to him, "Go, and you do likewise." Luke 10:36-37.
The scholar readily identified the one who showed compassion as the true neighbor, though he notably avoided naming him a Samaritan. Jesus then commanded him, "Go, and do likewise." To understand the message of the parable, we must first ask why Jesus chose a Samaritan. Was it because he had in mind a third occurrence of ve'ahavta, and you shall love, in Scripture? The stranger who lives with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, Leviticus 19:34. And wish to show that even foreigners are to be loved as oneself. It is possible, though he does not make his reasoning explicit. In any case, the Leviticus text already commands Israelites to love the stranger among them, so Jesus would not have needed to argue that they must be classified as neighbors in order to be loved. Perhaps the command existed, but it was not always faithfully practiced, and he sought to underscore its neglected importance. At the same time, Jesus' own attitude toward Gentiles in the Gospels reveals a certain tension. On the one hand, he clearly speaks of their future inclusion in the kingdom of God, and praises the faith of individual Gentiles. On the other hand, he shows reluctance to help foreigners and emphasizes that his commission was directed first and foremost to the lost sheep of Israel. Only after his resurrection does the mission to the Gentiles fully unfold. Furthermore, even though the Gospels suggest that Jesus viewed Samaritans as foreigners, or at least not fully part of the Jewish community, if the aim of the parable had been merely to illustrate that Gentiles are to be loved as neighbors, he could have used a Roman soldier rather than a Samaritan. But he did not, and this was deliberate. A Roman helping a Jew could have been dismissed as an exceptional incident, or even as a politically motivated act. A Samaritan, however, represented something far more unsettling. Samaritans struck too close to home. They were religious rivals who shared Israel's scriptures, claimed loyalty to the same God, disputed Israel's identity, and remembered and interpreted their shared history differently. Jesus did not choose a Samaritan because he was the most foreign, but because he was the most difficult to love. A Samaritan was not an outsider with whom Israel had no history, but a near neighbor marked by centuries of religious conflict, mutual resentment, and shared trauma. Much like siblings divided by inheritance disputes, or religious communities fractured by schism, Jesus went straight to the place where love hurts most. But there is more. In their final exchange, it becomes clear that Jesus never directly answered the Torah scholar's question, "Who is my neighbor?" Instead of narrowing the circle of who should be included, as the scholar likely expected, Jesus not only pushed the boundaries outward, but also redefined the issue altogether. What truly mattered was not deciding who qualified to belong inside or outside the exclusive category called neighbor, but understanding what it meant to be and act as one. Just as he had done earlier in verse 28, when he urged the scholar to put his knowledge of loving God and loving neighbor into practice, Jesus once again emphasized faith put into action over abstract definition and doctrinal debate. Both the priest and the Levite stood at the center of the covenant community, yet their behavior demonstrated the very opposite of love for a neighbor. In stark contrast, the Samaritan, the outsider long despised as an enemy, embodied what it truly means to love and act as a neighbor. He showed mercy to someone who was almost certainly his enemy, and who likely would not have done the same had the roles been reversed. He willingly set aside his own comfort and safety, went beyond addressing the man's immediate suffering, and ensured his continued care. The one who acted with love was the one you would least want to owe anything to, and even accepting his kindness would have been a hard pill to swallow.
Conclusion.
The parable of the Good Samaritan is not merely a comforting story about a traveler who did a charitable deed. It is a deeply unsettling mirror, revealing that love of one's neighbor is tested not with strangers at the far edges of the world, but close to home, at our own doorstep, among those with whom we share past conflict, mistrust, disappointment, and hurt. On the one hand, the parable confronts social, ethnic, and religious prejudice. On the other, it issues a radical call to action, to extend self-given love that demands real sacrifice of comfort, safety, and pride, even toward our enemies, and not merely toward our distant enemies, but toward those closest to us, the enemies who are our neighbors.